Just before I hand you over to today's host, Dr. Michelle Cannon, and our speakers today, just wanted to flag up that we have a new edition of the Film Education Journal launching today. It's one of our strongest editions yet. We've got a very international series of perspectives. We've got 2 essays about film education in Chile. We've got 2 essays talking about film education in Scotland, 2 from the wider UK, and 2 from Australia, one of which is written by our today's speaker, Marc Barrett from the Australian Council for Educational Research. We are incredibly grateful to Marc, who is dialing in from Melbourne, where I believe it is currently about 3 o'clock in the morning. Marc has been drinking a lot of coffee to keep himself awake, so we're very grateful to him for his heroic efforts in joining us today. We're also very grateful to Dr. Michelle Cannon, who'll be hosting the panel today, and Maria Leonida, who is also joining to kind of contribute her own perspectives. And finally, we also have a second event tomorrow afternoon, which we hope that those of you who are able will also be able to join us for. That event will be presenting the work of 2 Scottish high school teachers, Michael Daly and Jacqueline Thompson, who will be talking about their film education work, both in a film club setting and in the classroom. And that presentation will be specifically kind of geared towards addressing teachers. Anyway, that is enough from me today. Thank you very much to our speakers in advance, and I will now pass you over to Michelle. Thank you, Michelle.
Hi everyone. And it's such a pleasure to see such an international audience from looking at your names, a few familiar faces. So great, thank you for coming. Thanks Jamie and Flip and everyone at Film Education Journal for just giving us, Maria and Marc and myself, this opportunity to share and discuss practice in this public forum, because it doesn't happen very often, does it, basically, for film educators. So yes, thanks very much for that, and thank you for coming along on a dark, as it is in here in London anyway, a dark Thursday afternoon. Thanks for clicking on the link and making it. You've probably all been on Zoom for several hours already, so I do appreciate that. We'll try and make it lively for you. And we're looking forward to your contributions as well. So please do make those known in the chat. And if you want to contribute audio visually as well, that's entirely possible. You can also just make that known in the chat, because Flip is going to be keeping an eye on the chat and keeping an eye on any questions that might be coming through also. Great. So of all the many dimensions of beginner film pedagogies that we could be discussing this afternoon, or in the middle of the night for Marc, of course, we're here to focus on the introduction of film language and camera perspectives and meaning making to novice learners. So novice learners, whether they be primary school children or indeed postgraduates. So firstly, I'd just like to introduce Marc Barrett, the writer of the journal article that's the kind of springboard for our discussion this afternoon. And on a personal note, I have to say that when I read Marc's article, I noted a kind of kindred spirit about it, because we tended to come in, we came to what we're doing now from obliquely, from different kind of settings. So, and I think that's quite an important thing to recognise, the different ways that we all kind of enter into this field. And it's an important thing to recognise, I think. So Marc currently works for the Australian Council for Educational Research. He's worked in various different settings, including being a TV commercial director, as well as a primary school teacher, and now a consultant. So Marc, would you like to just say a few words before I introduce Maria?
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. First of all, I should apologise. I have a very insistent cat here, which you might have heard meowing away. She will make regular interruptions. she hates shut doors. So yeah, she's just going to interject regularly for the next hour or so. I apologise in advance. But mainly I just wanted to say thanks so much to you, Michelle and Jamie, and the whole Film Education Journal team for your incredible support with this paper. I think the Film Education Journal is just the most fabulous academic publication for promoting discussions of film in education. So thanks so much for letting me be a part of it. And also, I should thank my good friend Coffee, which is allowing me to be here with you today. So thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. So I just want to introduce you to Maria Leonida, who's speaking to us from Athens in Greece. Our particular paths have crossed over a number of years during European film and media education related projects. And she's a documentary film director, as well as being the co-founder and head of programs for an organization called Karpos with a K, which is a center for educational and intercultural communication. So like Mark, Maria's a passionate and imaginative advocate of film and the still image for learning, and also as important cultural touchstones and much more. So Maria, would you like to just say any more about yourself?
Thanks for inviting me, Michelle, first of all, to be a discussant in this interesting discussion. And I think I will try to give a perspective from Southern Europe, probably, and my own experience of actually having two hats. As you said, I'm a film director myself, and I must say that for the first years in my life, I was self-taught. So I went through this initial filmmaking learner's experience. So I can testify for this. And it was later that I went through formal film education, let's call it. And secondly, I've been running educational programs and designing them for children, teenagers, and teachers. So I can also have a perspective of what it means to teach and what it is to care for others people to learn and get involved into audiovisual expression.
Great. All right. Thanks very much for that. So it's now time for Mark to offer his presentation, which may take about 20 minutes. But before Mark does that, I'd just like to flag up a kind of framing device, if you like, for our discussion after the presentation. And it's something that you could perhaps be bearing in mind during the presentation. And again, if you have any kind of questions, either on this framing kind of question or indeed on anything that Mark's suggesting as he's going along, please do put that in the chat. So what I thought might be a generative kind of framing for this discussion is to put up, if you could flip in the chat, so initial film pedagogy. So by initial, I mean film for beginners. So initial film pedagogy as cultural experience. So there's a lot of different avenues that could be we could go down with that as a baseline. So okay, I will sign off now and hand over to Mark.
Great. Okay, so we have a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, to put simply, the aim of this paper is to introduce a resource that aspires to help bring semiotic understandings of the medium of film into classrooms in an accessible way. So it's really less an academic discussion and more a teaching tool with the associated rationale. But I'm actually not going to discuss the resource just yet. First, I wanted to talk about the journey that I took to the point where I felt a resource like this was necessary, or at least helpful. And to do that, I need to take you right back to the distant past, into the late 80s, to a wide-eyed film student in Year 11 Cinema Studies. That was my first introduction to a formal education in film. So over the years, I've had a few different experiences in film education. I had Year 11 Cinema Studies, which included theoretical and practical aspects of film. I then went to the Victorian College of the Arts undergraduate degree in film production. I spent nearly 10 years making corporate films and TV commercials, and then another 10 years in primary schools, where I incorporated filmmaking and viewing into a curriculum-wide program. And it was here where I saw both kids who longed to be pushed and challenged, and those who struggled with social and linguistic difficulties, both flourish using film in the classroom. So I saw it as an incredibly egalitarian medium to use in education. I then went on to mentoring teachers and designing film literacy programs for schools, where I teamed up with researchers and practitioners associated with the BFI. And they introduced me to some great work that the BFI had done in promoting practical film in education. And finally, 6 years ago, I arrived at the Australian Council for Educational Research, ACER, and I was introduced to semiotics and a more academic perspective on filmic meaning. So it was at ACER that I was introduced to the work of Gunter Kress and Theo van Leeuwen, and many others, in fact, who discussed semiotics and a kind of grammar of images that could be decoded in the same way as written language or print texts can be decoded. They talked about a systematic and, most importantly, a teachable methodology. So for me, I would say that this idea of a way of formally decoding visual images didn't really strike me as a revelation. It didn't seem new. It more seemed like an articulation of what I'd always known on some level, but never consciously understood. There was a set of rules, or maybe just guidelines, that explained the social and emotional symbology at work within the medium of film itself. Something that could be taught and understood explicitly by anyone, just like the grammar of natural language. And my immediate reaction to reading about this was, why has it taken more than 20 years of immersion in various forms of film education and practice to be introduced to this idea of filmic grammar? What has happened in my educational journey that has meant that I have skipped this particular articulation? Here's an example of what I've read. In Kress and van Leeuwen's 1990 publication, Reading Images, they applied Edward Hall's understanding of social distances to the analysis of photographic images of people. So here, I'm going to call this social distance proximity, which relates to, in this case, the distance from the camera to its subject, which in this case is a human subject. Hall suggests that there are 4 distinct distances between human beings and in Western culture that have distinct differences in social tension, so differences in intimacy and emotional and personal levels of engagement. And as such, they're reserved for different kinds of relationships. Kress and van Leeuwen state that this also applies to photographic images of people, because these images represent the same kind of relationship associations to an audience. So let's have a closer look. First, we see at the top of the screen there, we have the close personal distance. So that is the distance of an intimate association. It's reserved for those we have a more intimate relationship with. Or, on the negative side, of course, it forces a sense of intimacy upon us, even if we're unwilling. In a typical film parlance, this distance equates to what we might call the close-up. Next, we have the personal distance. It's friendly, less intimate, but still emotionally and personally engaged, though to a lesser extent than the intimate distance. This distance is equivalent to what we might call a mid-shot in filmic parlance. Third, we have the social distance. It's businesslike and involves the full body in one glance. It's engaged, but not necessarily intimate. It's equivalent to what we might call the long shot. Finally, we have the public distance. It's not socially engaged or intimate. It views the person in relation to their environmental context. It's the equivalent to what we might call an extreme long shot. So here, Kress and Van Leeuwen are introducing us to a language of images, letting us in on a codified meaning system implicit within the medium itself. There's a lot more to camera positions and perspective, of course, and how it influences the way images are interpreted, but that was just one example. Now, no doubt, there are many of you here today that already understand this association between proximity of the camera to its subject and how an audience emotionally responds to the subsequent image. Even if you hadn't read any work on semiotics, you probably know that this is more or less the case, that the medium itself holds some implicit meaning and affects how the contents of the image is interpreted by an audience. The interesting question for me became, how does one come to learn this? For me, I think I understood it on some level from the beginning, but perhaps not to the same structured formal degree as in Kress and Van Leeuwen's work. So what I've seen or witnessed across a variety of different film education settings is that this kind of semiotic understanding of how the camera creates emotional and psychological responses in an audience, regardless of the content of its images, was never explicitly and formally taught. In my experience, film students either came into the film education setting already aware of the emotional influence of the medium of film, or they didn't. And over the course of their tuition in film, some meaning was explored and debated. Perhaps a few more students grew to understand this emotional and psychological symbolism at work in filmic images. But still, there were many students who just never picked up that connection. And some of those latter students went on to productive careers in filmmaking, thinking of the camera as little more than a tool to record their ideas, not one that actually helps them articulate them. And yes, they know that a close-up is good for the important bits, and you need to start a scene with a long shot because it gives context to the action, but they didn't fully understand how camera placement affected how the action was interpreted by an audience. They didn't understand the power dynamics and the level of personal engagement that camera placement governs. They viewed filmmaking as like putting together an IKEA bookshelf. You insert panel A into hole B and produce object C. There you go, a film. Now, I think it's fair to say that there's probably a good reason for this lack of consistency when it comes to film students' understanding of filmic meaning. The meaning inherent in the medium of film is different in nature to the meaning of written texts. Film semiotic meanings are socially and culturally determined, so its meaning depends on the social and cultural context in which it is made and consumed. As a result, it can be difficult to pin down an inherent grammar of filmic images because it depends on the culture using and viewing it. It can appear then as though film has no rule book or no grammar to guide meaning making or interpretation. Writing, on the other hand, has its grammar. It has its rigid rules of meaning making that apply equally to all students everywhere. So I would argue that this makes written language a much easier medium to assess and possibly an easier medium to teach. But here's the rub. If we regard film as an essential literacy in the 21st century, which many researchers and educators do, then an understanding of the semiotics at work in the medium itself, the socially generated symbolic meanings of the images, must be important. It gives us film's grammar, if you will. It gives us the rule book, and it makes it a more transparent medium to teach and learn. So I concentrated on how I was taught and also how I'd taught others about film, and I came across what I thought was a common link. In every educational setting, at every level, film students were first introduced to the visual components of film in the same way, through the typical shot type list. And here's an example, which you'll probably recognise. This is a mock-up, but its contents of every shot type list that you've ever seen is more or less the same. We see 4 distinct shot type options representing the proximity of the camera to its human subject. You may note that the text next to these exemplar images simply describes what you can see in the image. So they tend not to add anything much that the image doesn't already relay. The meaning or influence that might come with each of these images is totally absent, except, strangely, the reference to high and low angles at the bottom of the page. Here it describes high angle shots as making the subject seem small and powerless, and it says that low angle shots make them seem large and powerful. At least this does acknowledge that the camera position indeed influences the way the subject is interpreted at any given narrative context. So I guess that's something. But I suspect that introducing students to film's constituent parts in this way tends to point them towards the idea that meaning is derived almost entirely from the film's content. Because this sort of shot type list sidesteps the influence of the medium itself, for the most part. The shot type list then just becomes about covering action rather than communicating ideas. And I know that as they continue to explore and study film, some students will make up this ground and perhaps develop their own systematic and organised understanding of film's inherent influence on meaning, but others won't. So what could we do as educators? It occurred to me that an update of the old shot type list couldn't hurt. And there are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, to front load students with the idea of film's inherent meaning-making potential so that no student misses it in their learning. And 2, to move film education more into the realm of language learning, that it is a medium that obeys socially generated rules of meaning-making, a kind of grammar, and that the medium of film is most powerful when it is thought of as a language. So in thinking about this update of the shot type list, there was some deliberation as to what semiotic understandings to include and what to leave out, as you could well imagine. So I had to look at what was universally applicable to all film students in all of their films, both viewed and made. And in my reading, I came across a fundamental truism about film, that every filmic image is the result of a mediated choice. Regardless of how aware the filmmakers are of the impact of their choices, they decide to place a camera in a certain position to record the action. Exactly what the action is usually changes, of course, from shot to shot, but the presence of a mediated perspective on the action never changes. So a singular mediated perspective, then, is one of film's constants. And because it is a filmic constant, it's a great place on which to pin a tool that attempts to bring semiotics into the classroom, because it will always be relevant. For the sake of this proposed teaching resource, we will break the notion of the camera's perspective into just 2 aspects: the proximity and the angle. We've already discussed Cress and Van Leeuwen's application of Hall's idea of social distances and the proximity of the camera. But here's a little reminder. Something that's important to remember here is that levels of intimacy and emotional or personal engagement can either be positive or negative depending on the narrative context around the image. For example, in a personal distance shot, a mid shot, for instance, the image will usually elicit a small degree of personal intimacy, but a high level of emotional engagement, whether or not the narrative context gives it a positive charge, as in this particular narrative, or a negative charge, as in the scene in which this shot appears. So it's important to remember when talking about film semiotic meaning that we're talking about the relationship between the audience and the human subjects in the image as a separate idea to the narrative context. As you may have noticed, Hall's description of the psychological impact of different social distances within that description, we can see that the closer the camera gets to the human subject, the more levels of intimacy and emotional engagement with the subject increase. And the further away we get from the subject, the more personal intimacy and engagement move towards the objective and to more contextual considerations. It might therefore be more accurate to view camera proximity not as a series of 4 or 5 discrete options, but as existing on a spectrum of almost infinite options. Any movement towards the closer end of the spectrum produces subtle nuances in difference in terms of levels of intimacy and emotional engagement, and any movement in the other direction, away from the human subject, produces nuanced changes towards objectivity. This is relevant to tracking shots as well as to proximity changes that are achieved through editing. So this helps to highlight to students that proximity can be considered a rich spectrum of specific meanings, a nuanced palette of film expressions, not just 4 options. The angle of the camera to its human subject can also be considered as existing on a spectrum of options. Chris and Van Leeuwen describe how even no difference in height can help to create empathy between audience and character. But it's certainly true that a little difference in height, as in these 2 examples, equates to a little power differential. And a great difference in height equates to a great power differential. So the power dynamics communicated through the relative height of the camera exists on a spectrum as well. So this new resource, I believe, needs to replace the perfunctory approach of shot types as demonstrated in the typical shot type list with something that is much richer in meaning. It needs to incorporate some key ideas. That the placement of the camera influences how an image's content is interpreted by an audience. That the shot types exist on a spectrum of many options, not just a handful. And that meaning is an inescapable consequence of camera placement and must always be front of mind. Of course, for practical reasons, the new resource really does need to be limited in its scope. So we acknowledge that there is more to camera perspective than just proximity and angle. But the resource has to be simple enough for it to be easy to use in the classroom. You can only articulate Western cultural understandings because basically that's the only one I have. Different cultures may have quite different understandings of the meaningful impact of camera placement. And it needs to compare meaning generated through image with the written word for ease of translation and use. But acknowledging, of course, that these 2 distinct languages aren't always easy to translate. Considering all of this, this is what I came up with. This is the proposed replacement of the typical shot type list. The first thing you may notice is that the 2 aspects of camera perspective, proximity and angle, are separate and very prominent. The double-ended arrows behind the exemplar images are meant to indicate that the example images represent options on a spectrum of choices. It's also meant to make clear that a moving camera, changing in angle or proximity, slides along this spectrum and indicates changes to the levels of intimacy or personal engagement during the course of a single shot. I'll go into a little more detail. So let's take a look at the shot types. You'll notice that the shot type names have changed. So the traditional close-up is now called an intimate shot, and the extreme close-up is referred to as an extremely intimate shot. The reason for this is to reinforce the emotive influence of the shot types on what is depicted, and helps to move away from the perfunctory mechanical phraseology. You might also notice the accompanying text in the box below the shot title. It attempts to translate the meaning of the shots in 3 different ways. First of all, it describes the level of emotional engagement of the shot. Next, it attempts to indicate what the shot type asks of the audience viewing it, in consideration of the socially interactive aspect of filmic texts. And then it attempts to indicate what kind of language may be used in translating the action in the shot into a natural language, in this case English, which I think, although not always accurate, does help students to understand meaning a little better. There's another notable feature in this resource. It's the section called the moving camera. Traditionally, we would find terms like pan and tilt in this section, but here too we've changed the emphasis. Firstly, it mentions the tracking shot. Now this is specifically a shot type that is unique in that the proximity of the subject may not change, but the background or environment around the subject does. So tracking shots, of course, don't have to behave this way, but here we're specifically calling out tracking shots that do behave that way. For this shot type, the perspective of the tracking camera creates a sense of energy or turmoil for the character. I think we all know that, but this should be noted for film students as it begins a discussion on the relationship between the shot's human subject and their environment. In the next section, the reveal, we've done away with references to panning or tilting and simply describe what the shot type achieves emotionally and intellectually. As a general rule, panning or tilting has the effect of revealing clues, details or features of its subject at a set pace, rather than encapsulating everything all at once in a single shot. The impact of the choice to slowly disclose information about a subject through panning or tilting has the effect of creating anticipation or tension in an audience. So this shot type is referred to simply as a reveal, and students can be taught that a reveal can be done horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. Now there are, of course, some important implications for using a tool like this in initiating students into the linguistic aspects of the filmic medium. First, it's worth acknowledging that if we shift our pedagogical focus from being about the mechanics of the medium to being about its inherent meaning, we change students' relationship to the medium. So film viewers will become film readers, essentially, and filmmakers become film authors. But of course, the ultimate goal of using a tool like this is that by front-loading students with this information at the start of their film learning journey, they all become more aware of the medium's inherent power and potential. And therefore, they become more critical consumers and, hopefully, more enabled communicators. Thank you all very much. I sincerely hope that there is something in this idea that you can take with you into your own film classrooms. Thanks very much. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. That was great, and very clear articulation of where you're coming from, and I appreciate that you've added an element of your own kind of personal journey towards that. And I encourage others to write down similar accounts. So thank you for that. And it's given us a lot of pause for thought. And I think possibly there'll be some people who would like to question that approach and to offer a range of perspectives on that. I think it might be fairly true to say that offering a meaning motivated model, which is reliant on language, is one way of doing it. Yeah. And there'll be others as well. And I think it's important to start this diversification process, because I think for many the shot list is the go-to first rung on the ladder. And sometimes that could be, you know, entirely justifiable and legitimate, but perhaps, you know, I'm wondering whether Maria might be able to offer a response to what Mark's been saying, and maybe offer some other examples of other approaches. And indeed, if anyone's got anything to say about this or what Mark's been saying in the chat, then please do post those questions. We have got one or two already. So Maria, I don't know if you want to respond. We can't hear you at the moment. Would you like to unmute? Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. Yes, I've been through the article as well, so I'm aware of the approach of Marc, and I appreciate very much the effort to put all this information in one sheet of paper. That's quite interesting and practical, and it's like a good mind exercise and a communication exercise too, how to put all this information in one explicit and simple text, actually drawing and visual text. I think it can be very useful to make the typical shot list more rich, as you said, Marc. My own background and maybe the path we went through, and I think I could testify for Greek young filmmakers, or even the way we would approach this in schools, is that we usually go more for the meaning making comes into practice quite a lot. And I would say that the first year of film school here, I actually checked it with a couple of people these days to be sure it still is this way. The learning and the teaching goes through extracts of films and through their own little projects. So that means that they don't really depend on this kind of shot list way of approaching, but the actual shot, the trying out approach and looking at films becomes the main axis of their learning. And I must say that myself, starting from still photography and then going into filmmaking, I had to discover bit by bit the power of each of these frames. And actually discovering, as we know in filmmaking or in audiovisual expression, is a crucial part of the process. So I must say that I think these paradigms of designing the shots are very useful for showing things, for making more concise the whole grammar. We definitely need this, because when I'm shooting in the streets and I have my cameraman next to me, I will tell him, come on, make a medium shot of this, or get a close-up. So it's definitely a very useful language, but I don't think that in terms of filmmaking and learning and developing yourself, whether you're 15 or 35, you really hook on this shot list. I think you grow out of it very quickly, to be honest. But the reason we teach it, and that's what I say when I do courses, is that we need to communicate quickly, and thanks to the shot list, we can do it. But I really like the way you've put everything in one page, and it's much more rich. It's more rich than the one we usually have. So I might be using it if it's free, and we can also have it around if it's possible, Marc. And so that will be my first response. Possibly this is a more European approach. I don't know if in Greece we have kind of a French style filmmaking approach, I think.
Yeah, which I greatly appreciate, by the way.
Although Anglo-Saxon tradition is very interesting, I must say. There are two details I wanted to point out in relation to your presentation. You said that maybe language is easier to teach in relation to filmmaking. Well, of course, the rules are much more explicit and they date back to like 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. But the truth is, language is easier, but is literature easier, Marc? I mean, filmmaking is often considered the artistic part of audiovisual, but so I think poetry is not easy to teach. And good literature is not easy to teach. Of course,
No.
children
No,
can
and
go out of school. You know what I mean? So
that's an excellent distinction. And I think there are certainly many film educators who would make a distinction between cinema, which might be film's version of literature, and just filmmaking or video, which is somehow less meaningful, more pragmatic, perhaps. But so I think there's a similar distinction in film between its sort of high art forms and its mass communication forms, as there is in natural language as well, and written text as well. Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels there.
Yeah. Anyway, it was thought, and one more before we give the floor to the audience or to Michelle again. You have this interesting question about the negative and the positive charge. You make a comment, and you interestingly give us an example as well, like from the Titanic, I think, and from Tarantino's film. I must say the positive charge, I fully understand. You know, a couple in love is always positive. It will never be negative. But for your negative example, when we have the two gunmen from the Tarantino film, if I'm not mistaken, I don't think I would call it negative, but maybe the word that come into mind when I see the two men is this a male charge? Is it dynamic? Is it violence? Is it the attack? But I don't think, and I would comment it as a negative thing, because it's holding a gun in the filmmaking world is not necessarily negative. So I think it's more rich than negative as well.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. Perhaps it wasn't the ideal example. And the idea of a narrative charge, a positive or negative charge, really comes from Robert McKee, if you know Robert McKee. And he talks about scenes within a film having always having a human value at its crux, at its center, and that scenes always flow from a negative to a positive charge, or a positive to a negative, or from slightly positive to more negative. So he uses those absolute terms, which I think are limited, but they do describe, they do help to articulate.
You see, I really like this. I mean, the scenes, of course, have a positive or negative charge in relation to the narrative, but maybe not the shots. You see what I mean?
Right. Yes, yes.
I think the scene, every scene is a construction. And when we are in the editing table, we build the scene exactly to achieve some kind of charge. And that's really, but the shot, I think, is a more minimal part of the construction and doesn't necessarily have a positive or negative, I think.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's all. Maybe we should open the discussion.
Yes, thank you both. That was really, really useful discussion, and many distinctions kind of clarified there. Thank you, Maria, for your response. I'd just like to reinforce the fact that Marc's resource is in no way proprietary, and anyone can download it and use it and adapt it, I'm sure, as necessary, which would be a fantastic thing. So thank you very much. I just want to revisit the frame that I was offering earlier, because I thought it might be a kind of useful bridge to not to make things too simplistic, but what has been called this European notion of the world building and the scene setting, and then the more kind of granular, let's start with the units first, that is favoured, I have to say, more by Northern Europeans and perhaps the Australian dimension as well. Oh, there's the cat. Okay. And in using this word, film pedagogy as a cultural experience, I hoped that this might kind of bridge those two approaches in a way that, because precisely, meaning and the ways in which meanings are made and shared and created and distributed and interpreted is essentially, one of the constituents of culture. But of course, also, if you start with the culture and then move inwards, you start with the macro, moving to the micro, which is perhaps could be a way of describing a more European approach, then somewhere in the middle there's a meeting. And as we've said in the past, Mark, in past discussions, that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. So, you know, it's important not to set these up in opposition in many ways. Okay, so I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking we should be moving towards the questions in the chat and opening questions up to the floor. If anyone's got anything they would like to say to voice those questions, or please do so now. So I'm getting messages here, collating all these responses. Now, Becky, who I have to say is a UK friend and colleague, got in quite early in the chat and was suggesting that she is regarding her filmmakers already as emergent filmmakers. So what her interest revolves around trying to get them to articulate their already understood or intuitive understandings of film. So perhaps that is something, correct me if I'm not wrong, Becky, that you're suggesting that this kind of more granular approach seems to interfere with that in some way. Please unmute if you'd like to come back, or indeed Mark or Maria, if you'd like to comment on that as young learners as emergent filmmakers, and should we be interfering with the intuitive process?
Yeah, no, it's not. I wasn't sorry. This is Becky speaking. It's too late in the evening, and this is my third seminar of the day, webinar. So, I'm being shy, but I no, didn't mean it actually as that it might interfere. But I'm really trying to work on this idea of emergent, sort of drawing parallels from primary education and the idea of emergent literacy. That children, obviously, we acknowledge in lots of contexts, and so my work is mostly focused on children, but so we acknowledge that they have these kind of funds of knowledge about film or understandings of film. And often, because it was really interesting that you started with the fact that often doing film production flips who is successful, and we see students kind of suddenly being able to create things that are way beyond people's expectation of them. And one of the reasons I feel that happens is because they're able to connect with existing repertoires of expertise that they have, often about popular culture and film. But so my point at which I'm always getting stuck is, so how do we enable those students to articulate those intuitive knowledges more effectively, both obviously within filmmaking, but in other forum as well? So the thing that, and it is really early days, but I'm just kind of trying to work on this idea of them as emergent, almost imagining, you know, if we were you know, if they, rather than tell them all the lessons that all the people that have ever made films have learned, allow them to be beginner filmmakers who are doing what the Lumiere brothers did, or that, you know, so they're kind of, you know, that we acknowledge that they've got some knowledge from their existing experiences, but they also need to go through some of those processes. But I think actually I really love the idea of revisiting the shot list, because at some point children are hungry for that grammar. So I think having something that, I think that in the chat people have been saying you could use both, and I would add to that children like making up their own names for shots as well, so it's kind of part of the meaning making process. So maybe this would be a way of helping them make that knowledge explicit.
Quite, just to democratize the process. Yes, sorry, Mark.
No, I absolutely agree, and I also think that and I think most of their presentation really focused on the idea of replacing and probably suggesting that we totally discard the typical shot type list, but there's absolutely no reason why they can't work side by side. And I think the good thing that this new resource does do is it provides a meta language for students to talk about filmmaking and their film viewing, but it just does it in a richer way. So I agree with you. I think we could use both. I think this new resource could happen further down in the educational journey of a student. But at some point, I feel though that an explicit acknowledgement of all the work that's been done into filmic grammar needs to be incorporated into a student's filmic learning at some point, but it certainly doesn't have to be right at the beginning. And I love the idea of emergent filmmakers discovering their own language. I think that's wonderful, and I think that reflects the the art and the personalized way that we can communicate with film.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's no reason why we can't incorporate all those ideas.
Thanks, Becky. And I particularly just want to reinforce that idea of giving young learners in particular, or anybody, the linguistic tools to be able to talk about what they're doing and put a label on what they're doing and explaining why they're doing it. I think that there's something empowering about that when it comes to talking about what they're doing, which is something that interests me. Okay, thanks, Becky. Linda, I didn't know, I noticed that you are working in Scotland with some young people, and you're interested in instructing or working with your children so that they're socially aware global citizens. Now, I'm just interested in that question in relation to what we're talking about. Did you see a connection somewhere between what you're doing at the moment and what Mark's presentation was about, or were you just making a general comment? Do you want to unmute or just put something?
Hi. Yeah. So I've just come into film teaching.
Yeah.
It's all very new to me, so I'm still getting to grips with it myself. But just curious that there was Mark had commented on how we read films culturally. So how our culture, I suppose, how we bring our own baggage or how we bring our own experiences to anything that we watch, whether that's artwork or a piece of film. So I'm just interested in whether we think, I'm constantly trying to show them a range of different artworks as an art and design teacher, but also now that I'm into film, trying to show them different types of film from different locations. And now I'm concerned that maybe that might lead to some confusion. So I don't know how other people feel about that. Is that likely to sort of confuse the message that we're trying to teach them, or do we think it's healthy to show them things from different cultures and encourage them to think like other people or to experience film from different viewpoints in that way?
Okay, would either of our discussants like to come back on that? No? Okay, well, go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that that's a really good point. Sorry, no, go on, Michelle. I'm ruminating.
I was just going to say that any opportunity that young people get to become exposed to a variety of different filmic texts from a variety of international contexts is a good thing. It's just a question of framing. I don't think there's I don't think the question of them being confused should enter into it, because it's just a question of what you choose to concentrate on and give them a focus. I think that's the important thing, whether that focus is a cultural focus or a filmic focus or some kind of aspect of film language. If you just give them something to focus on, then we've all got something to talk about, and they will have something to talk about.
I think it's fair to say too that in literary texts from different cultures, if you're introducing a literary text from another culture to your students, you would need to acknowledge the difference in perspective. And I think film is the same. I think you can show films from different cultures to your students and just articulate that the way it's being presented is, it's articulated in a slightly different way from a slightly different perspective. And I think that broadens their perceptions as well. It's about how to express and how people perceive.
And if you are showing, if you're choosing an aspect of film language, and it doesn't matter how kind of nominally small that is, it could be the close-up, or it could be light or whatever, to show them that there are aspects of film which have a universality. So that could be the hook on which you show them a range of different texts.
Yeah, and I think it mentions in the paper actually that different cultures may have different understandings of those social distances, for instance, but there will be some distinction between those social distances in almost every human culture. So even though the precise definitions might change from culture to culture, the fact that there are distinctions won't change. Does that make sense? So an extreme close-up might mean something slightly different in one culture as opposed to another, but there still will be a difference between the impact of an extreme close-up and a long shot within that culture.
Thank you, Linda. Thanks. I just wanted to bring in Saskia here. Saskia, who I met relatively recently, actually, and she's working in a virtual film school. Would you like to just tell us something? You've mentioned something about an exercise or an activity you did with a POV shot.
Yes. I actually have been running film clubs in a primary school for many years, but that is sort of as a volunteer, really. My normal job is outreach manager at the London Film School, and recently, because of lockdown, we transferred our film club activities in schools in a virtual setting. And because of that, we started to look at different ways how to teach film to children, to young children and also secondary school children. And we decided that rather than look at it from the point of view of looking at story and how do you best translate a story in a filmic way, we sort of stripped it all back down to, let's talk about certain elements like point of view, or light and shadow, or we started off with a Lumiere minute, and working from that, we're doing frame within a frame. So each week the children actually look at a different aspect of filmmaking, and they just experiment within that theme. And they don't need to think about story, they don't need to think about beginning, middle and end. We have also spoken to them about different shot sizes, but more as part of, for example, our point of view exercise. So this week we, just because at the moment I'm delivering this in 4 different schools, and it's really interesting to see what comes back in, what the children upload each week. And it's so interesting because of course they then start to use film grammar and learn as they go along, just to see what works and what doesn't work. So that hopefully by the end, when we say, okay, now interpret a story, they can use these elements and they have a lot more tools available to them to bring a story to life using these techniques. And like one of the previous speakers said, that I really believe that it doesn't matter if they are primary school children or college age children or other young people or adults, you can teach people the same exercise and they just interpret it in different ways, or they run with it. It's actually not that difficult to grasp. It's just fun to experiment with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's got to be fun, and it very often is fun.
It is really good fun, especially, yeah, this point of view exercise is really excellent. And I was just looking back at the PowerPoint presentation which we did, which has a clip of E.T. I don't know if you remember E.T. when during Halloween, and he's being pushed down the street and he's watching it through 2 circles that have been cut out of a sheet, and you see E.T.'s point of view. And then we also show them how they did that shot, and it's great because then the children just emulate that themselves at home using, you know, I just got a clip in from a primary school child who made a little film of him eating crisps out of a crisp packet, and he put his phone in the crisp packet, so he's shooting up, so you see his face and a hand coming in taking out the crisps and eating it, and then you see another shot of him from somebody else's point of view and for him eating it. you know, and it's like a mind-blowing thing for someone to realize the
It's
effect that
the
your
relate
film
the
has
sheer
on an audience.
the relatability of what they see, and then what they are empowered to reenact relatively quickly after it is
Yes,
intoxicating in many ways.
it really is. Yeah.
Thank you, Saskia, for that. I'm noticing here a comment from Scott Donaldson, who I know to be resident in Scotland. And I don't know if you want to come in here, Scott, but he's making the point about the ongoing mediated process that, indeed, I think, Mark, you also talked about the constant that is the mediated process or mediated experience in film. And Scott, you're saying here that please come in if you want. A difference between written language and film language is that film keeps on going. It doesn't stop. And while the eye can and does go back and forth on the page, the flow of the film is critical. So, and I think it's right to make our learners constantly aware of that constant film delivery, which is multi-layered, multi-textured, multimodal all the time. So yeah, I think it's important to say, yes, these are the shots, but this is, you know, it's going to fit into the process. So it's a question of where we start. Do we start here or do we start here? I'm still conjuring with this, as most academics do, sit in the middle and look around and consider all options. Okay. Anything else?
Go ahead. Do you want me to say something?
Yes,
Yeah. Well,
please, Scott. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just as you know, I think film is such a complex, it's such a dense medium. It's full of so much that it's the various different constituent parts. I don't think really can have that specific and immanent meaning, and so much depends on what else is in the picture, what else is on the soundtrack, what comes before and what comes after. Like Saskia was saying, point of view is really, really important. And any number of times I've spoken to groups of teachers and students and so forth, and asked them what a point of view shot is. And, you know, eventually you do get the answer, well, you're looking through the camera as if you're the person in the film. But very often they can't tell you, because you can't see the character, because you're behind the character's eyes. They can't actually tell you how they know that you are in that character's POV. And it's quite simple. In most cases, it's because the shot before, you see them look, then you see what they look at, and then you get the reaction shot, typically. Of course, there's other ways to run that 3-shot figure, and you can also do it with, handheld camera, and there are other kind of techniques as well. But most people are not aware of it. So what Becky Parry was saying right at the beginning, that kind of intuitive understanding, what you're trying to do is surface that intuitive understanding so that that library that they've got in their heads becomes available to them and transparent to them. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of inductive teaching, using film texts and just taking them to bits as they are, rather than saying this is what a close-up is, or whatever, and what it means. Yes, of course, there's a difference between a close-up and a long shot, but it's the combination of all of these things and sound that does the business. You know, it took years and years and years for people to work out how to construct point of view and how to show simultaneous action in 2 different places, etc., etc.
Yeah, quite right, Scott. Thank you very much for that. We might wind up very shortly, but I just wanted to touch on something that Tom Barron's up further up in the chat mentioned, and he questioned the need to change the vocabulary. Well, I see what you're saying, but I think there's also value in creating this, what Mark described as a kind of palette of approaches for which there may need to be different names. And I just, yeah, and again, I love that idea of Becky having the children make up their own names. But yes, so did any of our discussants want to come back on anything that's been said so far?
I would like to say something, if it's possible. I think it was a very interesting discussion. I would like to connect a few things that we've been saying. I find that there is a critical point in the so-called emergent filmmakers that Becky mentioned, whether they are 7 or 17, and because I find connections from people that just start getting into this language, or people that have been trying a few things out. And that is a critical point. It connects to what Scott said. It's a very complicated medium. It's very intellectual, actually. So of course, everybody can grab a mobile phone and make a couple of shots, or some students can make some very imaginative point of view shots, as you described, Saskia, because you gave them a very specific framework. A point of view exercise is a very specific thing, and many people or many age people could react to that better or worse, or more imaginatively or less, or depending on how much time they would devote, or how many films they've seen as well. However, from a point of view exercise, to arrive to a scene with a charge, as Mark said, so like a small text that expresses more than a point of view shot, however imaginative it might be, that is a critical point. I think for me, it's like watching a child trying to walk and a child already running. There's a huge step between those two stages. So even with teenagers, when we work, you can see the difference of young people that have been understanding the magic and the complexity of the medium. As Scott said, if a sound is coming right next to the image, or if, for example, what does it mean to make a one-shot narrative? This is let's call it an activity I've been doing with teenagers, and the one-shot narrative is looks simple, but it's actually very, very complicated. So it all starts from a single still photograph. And that is an example of how you have emergent filmmakers, this is quite an interesting term actually, to become more eloquent. But I find that it's not easy. Of course, there are talented people here and there, but we're not talking about the talents, we're talking about the masses now. I think film education is thinking of the big masses and not the special people that we meet sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you very much for those thoughts, Maria. I think it's probably time to wind up this discussion. I really want to thank you all for such a fruitful discussion, and I do feel that, you know, we need more of these kinds of spaces and colloquiums. Is that what you call them? There's all sorts of different names for them now. There isn't conference. And it really does feel like a proper kind of community of practice that we could build up here. There's a lot of expertise present in this audience, and I really appreciate that. You mentioned the word eloquence, Maria, and I think we are all kind of stumbling towards being able to articulate what visual eloquence means, and I think if this is a stepping stone to that, then that's a good thing. Let's do more of it. Okay, so I'm going to sign off there. Thank you again, Mark, for being up at this crazy time in the morning. Please go to bed. And Maria, thank you very much for your thoughts. So insightful, and everyone else who's contributed. So thanks very much.
Yeah, wonderful. I've got to say, I really enjoyed the discussion, and I wouldn't have missed it for the world, even if it is almost 5 o'clock in the morning.
And folks, if I could just say finally, one more thank you to Mark. Heroic efforts. Apologies about the teething problems with PowerPoint. We got there in the end. Thank you to everybody for attending. I think, as Michelle's already commented upon, it's one of the real silver linings in the kind of the difficulties that we all find ourselves in at the moment, that we're able to kind of bring this incredible international forum together, where we're able to kind of be talking to Mark in Australia, to Maria in Greece, and to have so many of you with us from really all across the world. So thank you all very much for attending. And finally, we do hope that we'll see some of you at our Scottish Teachers event, the second event in our winter symposium tomorrow. And one last plug for the Film Education Journal. We've got a new edition coming out, hot off the press today, which contains Mark's essay in it. And please do, as Michelle says, so much expertise in the room, digitally speaking. Please do consider submitting something to us. We'd love to hear some of your voices and consider your pieces for submission. So yes, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, all of you, for your time, and hopefully see you tomorrow. Cheers, folks.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.